Hi, I'm going to read chapter 3 of Momo today. This chapter is called Make Believe. Although Momo listened to grown-ups and children with equal sympathy and attention, the children had a special reason for enjoying their visits to the amphitheater as much as they did. Now that she was living there, they found they could play better games than ever before. They were never bored for an instant, but not because she contributed a lot of ingenious suggestions. Momo was there and joined in. That was all. But for some reason, her mere presence put bright ideas into their heads. They invented new games every day, and each was an improvement on the last. One hot and sultry afternoon, a dozen or so children were sitting around on the stone steps waiting for Momo, who had gone for a stroll nearby, as she sometimes did. From the look of the sky, which was filled with fat black clouds, there would soon be a thunderstorm. "I'm going home," said one girl, who had a little sister with her. "Thunder and lightning scares me." "What about when you're at home?" asked a boy in glasses. "Doesn't it scare you there?" "Of course it does," she said. "Then you may as well stay here," said the boy. The girl shrugged her shoulders and nodded. After a while, she said, "But maybe Momo won't turn up." "So what?" another voice broke in. It belonged to a rather ragged and neglected-looking boy. "Even if she doesn't, we can still play a game." "All right, but what?" "I don't know, something or other." "Something or other's no good. Anyone got an idea?" "I know," said a fat boy with a high-pitched voice. "Let's pretend the amphitheater's a ship, and we sail off across uncharted seas and have adventures. I'll be the captain, you can be first mate, and you can be a professor, a scientist, because it's a scientific expedition. The rest of you can be sailors." "What about us girls?" came a plaintive chorus. "What'll we be?" "Girl sailors. It's a ship of the future." The fat boy's idea sounded promising. They tried it out, but everyone started squabbling and the game never got underway. Before long, they were all sitting around on the steps again, waiting. Then Momo turned up, and everything changed. The Argo's bow rose and fell, as she swiftly but steadily steamed through the swell towards the South Coral Sea. No ship in living memory had ever dared to sail these perilous waters, which abounded with shoals, reefs, and mysterious sea monsters. Most deadly of all was the so-called traveling tornado, a waterspout that forever roamed this sea like some cunning beast of prey. The waterspout's route was quite unpredictable, and any ship caught up in its mighty embrace was promptly reduced to matchwood. Being a research vessel, of course, the Argo had been specially designed to tackle the traveling tornado. Her hull was entirely constructed of adamantium, a steel as tough and flexible as a sword blade, and had been cast in one piece by a special process that dispensed with rivets and welded seams. For all that, few captains and crews would have had the courage to face such incredible hazards. Captain Gordon of the Argo had that courage. He gazed down proudly from the bridge at the men and women of his crew, all of whom were experts in their particular field. Beside him stood his first mate, Jim Ironside, an old salt who had already survived 127 hurricanes. Stationed on the sun deck further aft were Professor Eisenstein, the expedition's senior scientist, and his assistants, Moira and Sarah, who had as much information stored in their prodigious memories as a whole reference library. All three were hunched over their precision instruments, quietly conferring in complicated scientific jargon. Seated cross-legged a little apart from them was Momo-san, a beautiful native girl. Now and again the professor would consult her about some special characteristic of the South Coral Sea, and she would reply in her melodious hula dialect, which he alone could understand. The purpose of the expedition was to discover what caused the traveling tornado and, if possible, make the sea safe for other ships by putting an end to it. So far, however, there had been no sign of the tornado, and all was quiet. Quite suddenly, the captain's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from the lookout in the captain's nest. From a shout from the lookout in the crow's nest. "Captain!" he called down, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Unless I'm crazy, there's a glass island dead ahead of us." The captain and Jim Ironside promptly leveled their telescopes. Professor Eisenstein and his two assistants hurried up, bursting with curiosity, but the beautiful native girl calmly remained seated. The peculiar customs of her tribe forbade her to seem inquisitive. When they reached the glass island, as they very soon did, the professor scrambled down a rope ladder and gingerly stepped ashore. The surface was not only transparent, but so slippery that he found it hard to keep his footing. The island was circular and about 50 feet across, with a sort of dome in the center. On reaching the summit, the professor could distinctly make out a light flashing deep in the heart of the island. He passed this information to the others, who were eagerly lining the ship's rail. "From what you say," said Moira, "it must be a blanc magneus viscosus." "Perhaps," Sarah chimed in, "though it could equally be a Jellybeania multicolorata." Professor Eisenstein straightened up and adjusted his glasses. "In my opinion," he said, "we're dealing with a variety of the common Chocolatus indigestibilis. But we can't be sure till we've examined it from below." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when 3 girl sailors, all of whom were world-famous scuba divers and had already pulled on their wetsuits, plunged over the side and vanished into the blue depths. Nothing could be seen for a while but air bubbles. Then one of the girls, Sandra, shot to the surface. "It's a giant jellyfish," she gasped. "The other 2 are caught up in its tentacles and can't break loose. We must save them before it's too late." So saying, she disappeared again. Without hesitation, 100 frogmen, led by Commander Franco, nicknamed the Dolphin because of his skill and experience, dived into the sea. A tremendous battle raged beneath the surface, which soon became covered with foam, but the gigantic creature's strength was such that not even 100 brave men could release the girls from its terrible embrace. The professor turned to his assistants with a puzzled frown. "Something in these waters seems conducive to the growth of abnormally large sea creatures," he observed. "What an interesting phenomenon." Meanwhile, Captain Gordon and his first mate had come to a decision. "Back!" shouted Jim Ironside. "All hands back on board. We'll have to slice the monster in half. It's the girl's only hope." Dolphin, Franco, and his frogmen climbed back on board. After going astern for a short distance, the Argo headed straight for the jellyfish at maximum speed. The steel ship's bow was as sharp as a razor. Without a sound, almost without a jolt, it sliced the huge creature in half. Although this maneuver was fraught with danger for the girls entangled in its tentacles, Jim Ironside had gauged his course to within a hair's breadth and steered right between them. Instantly, the tentacles on each half of the jellyfish went limp and lifeless, and the trapped girls managed to extricate themselves. They were welcomed back on board with joy. Professor Einstein hurried over to them. "It was all my fault," he said. "I should never have sent you down there. Forgive me for risking your lives like that." "There's nothing to forgive, Professor," one of the girls replied with a carefree laugh. "It's what we came for, after all." "Danger's our trade," the other girl put in. But there was no time to say more. Because of the rescue operation, the captain and his crew had completely forgotten to keep watch on the sea. Only now, in the nick of time, did they become aware of the traveling tornado, that the traveling tornado had appeared on the horizon and was racing towards them. An immense roller tossed the Argo into the air, hurled her onto her side, and sent her plummeting into a watery abyss. Any crew less courageous and experienced than the Argos would have been washed overboard or paralyzed with fear by this very first onslaught. But Captain Gordon stood foursquare on his bridge, as though nothing had happened, and his sailors were just as unperturbed. Momo-san, the beautiful native girl, had been unaccustomed to such storm-tossed seas, was the only person to take refuge in a lifeboat. The whole sky turned pitch black within seconds. Shrieking and roaring, the tornado flung itself at the Argo, alternately catapulting her sky high and sucking her down into cavernous troghs. Its fury seemed to grow with every passing minute as it strove in vain to crush the ship's steel hull. The captain calmly gave orders for the first mate, who passed them on to the crew in a stentorian voice. Everyone remained at his or her post. Professor Einstein and his assistants, far from abandoning their scientific instruments, used them to estimate where the eye of the storm must be, for that was the course to steer. Captain Gordon secretly marveled at the composure of these scientists, who were not, after all, as closely acquainted with the sea as himself and his crew. A shaft of lightning zigzagged down and struck the ship's hull, electrifying it from stem to stern. Sparks flew whenever the crew touched anything, but none of them worried. Everyone on board had spent months training for just such an emergency. The only trouble was the thinner parts of the ship, cables and stanchions, for instance, began to glow like the filament in an electric light bulb. And this made the crew's work harder, despite the rubber gloves they were wearing. Fortunately, the glow was soon extinguished by a downpour heavier than anyone on board, with the exception of Jim Ironside, had ever experienced. There was no room for any air between the raindrops. They were too close together, so they all had to put on masks and breathing apparatus. Flashes of lightning and peals of thunder followed one another in quick succession. The wind howled, and mass high-breakers deluged everything with foam. With all engines running full ahead, the Argo inched her way forward against the elemental might of the storm. Down below in the boiler room, engineers and stokers made superhuman efforts. They had lashed themselves in place with stout ropes so that the ship's violent pitching and tossing would not hurl them into the open furnaces. But when, at long last, the Argo and her crew reached the innermost eye of the storm, what a sight confronted them! Gyrating on the surface of the sea, which had been ironed flat as a pancake by the sheer force of the storm, was a huge figure. Seemingly poised on one leg, it grew wider the higher one looked, like a mountainous humming top rotating too fast for the eye to make out in any detail. "A teetotum elasticum!" the professor exclaimed gleefully, holding on to his glasses to prevent them from being washed off his nose by the rain. "Maybe you'd care to translate that," growled Jim Ironside. "We're only simple seafaring folk, and—" "Don't bother the professor now," Sarah broke in, "or you'll ruin a unique opportunity. This spinning-top creature probably dates from the earliest phase of life on Earth. It must be over 1 billion years old. The one variety known today is so small you can only see it under a microscope. It's sometimes found in tomato ketchup, or, even more rarely, in chewing gum. A specimen as big as this may well be the only one in existence." "But we're here to eliminate it," said the captain, shouting to make himself heard above the sound of the storm. "All right, Professor, tell us how to stop that infernal thing." "Your guess is as good as mine," the professor replied. "We scientists have never had a chance to study it." Very well, said the captain. We'll try a few shots at it and see what happens. What a shame, the professor said sadly. Fancy shooting the sole surviving specimen of a teetotum elasticum. But the anti-friction gun had already been trained on the giant spinning top. Fire! Ordered the captain. The twin barrels emitted a tongue of flame a mile long. There was no bang, of course, because an anti-friction gun, as everyone knows, bombards its target with proteins. The flaming missiles streaked towards the teetotum, but were caught and deflected. They circled the huge figure a few times, traveling even faster, even higher, until they disappeared into the black clouds overhead. It's no use, Captain Gordon shouted. We'll simply have to get closer. We can't, sir, Jim Ironside shouted back. The engines are already running full ahead, and that's only just enough to keep us from being blown astern. Any suggestions, Professor? The captain asked, but Professor Einstein merely shrugged. His assistants were equally devoid of ideas. It looked as if the expedition would have to be abandoned as a failure. Just then, someone tugged at the professor's sleeve. It was Momo-san, the beautiful native girl. Malumba, she said, gesturing gracefully. Malumba ositu sono. Irweni samba and saltu lobo bindra. Kramuna he beni beni sadoba. The professor raised his eyebrows. Babula. Babalu, he said, inquiringly. Didi maha fenosi into gedonin malumba. The beautiful native girl nodded eagerly. Dodo afa shulamat vada, she replied. Oi, oi, said the professor, thoughtfully, stroking his chin. What does she say? Asked the first mate. She says, explained the professor, that her tribe has a very ancient song that would send the traveling tornado to sleep, or would if anyone were brave enough to sing it to the creature. Don't make me laugh, growled Jim Ironside. Who ever heard of singing a tornado to sleep? What do you think, Professor? Asked Sarah. Is this scientifically feasible? One should always try to keep an open mind, said the professor. Many of these native traditions contain a grain of truth. The teetotum elasticum may be sensitive to certain sonic vibrations. We simply know too little about its mode of existence. It can't do any harm, the captain said firmly, so let's give it a try. Tell her to carry on. The professor turned to Momo-san and said, Malumba didi osafal huna huna vavadu? She nodded and began to sing a most peculiar song. It consisted of a handful of notes, repeated over and over again. Eni meni alubeni, vanatai susurateni. As she sang, she clapped her hands and pranced around in time to the refrain. The tune and the words were so easy to remember that the rest joined in, one after another, until the entire crew was singing, clapping and cavorting around in time to the music. Nothing could have been more astonishing than to see the professor himself and that old sea dog, Jim Ironside, singing and clapping like children in a playground. And then, lo and behold, the thing they never thought would happen came to pass. The traveling tornado rotated more and more slowly until it came to a stop and began to sink beneath the waves. With a thunderous roar, the sea closed over it. The storm died away, the rain ceased, the sky became blue and cloudless, the waves subsided. The Argo lay motionless on the glittering surface, as if nothing but peace and tranquility had ever reigned there. Members of the crew, said Captain Gordon, with an appreciative glance at each in turn, we pulled it off. The captain never wasted words, they all knew, so they were doubly delighted when he added, I'm proud of you. I think it must really have been raining, said the girl who had brought her little sister along. I'm soaked, that's for sure. She was right. A real storm had broken and moved on, and no one was more surprised than she to find that she had completely forgotten to be scared of the thunder and lightning while sailing aboard the Argo. The children spent some time discussing their adventurous voyage and swapping personal experiences. Then they said goodbye and went home to dry off. The only person slightly dissatisfied with the outcome of the game was the boy who wore glasses. Before leaving, he said to Momo, "I still think it was a shame to sink the Teetotum elasticum, just like that. The last surviving specimen of its kind, imagine. I do wish I could have taken a closer look at it." But on one point they were all agreed. The games they played with Momo were more fun than any others. Thank you. That's it for Chapter 3. Bye.